Like so often in the past, Huawei and Samsung brought their new flagship phones to market. The Galaxy S20 Ultra came earlier. The Huawei P40 Pro just came in the last weeks. And they are both excellent phones. I've looked into both of them in detail, and people who follow me on my channel, they know that in particular on Huawei, I have quite a lot to say because I was shooting with cameras from Huawei phones for a long time, and I did a lot of reviews on the Huawei P30 Pro. I think I know these phones very well, and I was very excited to see what the P40 Pro has newly to offer, and I think is a very meaningful upgrade I have here in my hands. But I was also always interested in Samsung phones, and the S20 Ultra did catch my attention immediately when it was announced because of that feature which Samsung calls the space zoom. And I think in general the hardware on both phones is fantastic. These manufacturers of smartphones brought two really capable, powerful machines to market. Small computers with a lot of power and capabilities, in particular when it comes to photography. But there is one reason why I personally think that Samsung, despite excellent hardware, completely messed it up. And this video is all about it. It's not a complete review of both phones, although I will show a lot of details and share a lot of insights. And I want to focus on that particular aspect, which in my opinion kills the Samsung S20 Ultra when it is compared with the P40 Pro. So let's get started. So let's warm up by looking a little bit at the native camera apps which are in those phones here. So this is the S20 Ultra. You have the native camera app here. You have single take. Single take basically combines various images into one scene. And I show this in a moment in the help section of the camera app. You have the normal photo app. You have your settings here. And in the settings, you can use all kinds of features. Scene optimizer. They have AI features implemented it. You can control your camera by voice. You have self-timer. You have resolutions to set. Frames per second if you go into the video section. All of that quite nice. I think in general, it's a very good interface. Something very special here in the video mode is the 8K video feature. So you can toggle here between 8K, 9:16 aspect ratio and different other video modes. And 8K is very nice. And I show an example in a moment how you can use this to actually grab frames with a high resolution. And that's something I appreciate. Very good and very well built. And then you have the more section where you get all the additional features. So you have a pro mode for photo, a pro mode for video, where you can adjust, your settings like shutter speed, ISO, everything manual. You have a night mode. The night mode works well. I tried it out. I think it's the best night mode we've seen on Samsung smartphones so far. You have hyperlapse, which is another word for a time lapse. You have slow motion, super slow motion, with even more frames per second to slow down on your scene. You have live focus video and live focus photo. And live focus is the aperture mode on Samsung phones, so you get some shallow depth of field and some bokeh simulation in the background. If you take portraits, for instance, you have a panorama mode and a food mode. And if you want to know what these modes are all about, there is also a help section here. And for instance, on single take, you see here, shoot scenes once to capture all the meaningful moments in a series of pics and short clips. And I think that's a nice automated feature, which you can use in order to create stunning captures of scenes in various ways. So that's typically what we have on Samsung phones. You also see here that there are not many sections to toggle between on the horizontal swipe here. That is different on Huawei. Most of the stuff which is advanced or special you find in the more section at the very end when you toggle here and swipe to the right hand side on the S20 Ultra. Looking at the native camera app in the Huawei P40 Pro, they have much more to swipe here. They also have here the more section. And in the more section, you have all kinds of things. You have time-lapse, which is hyperlapse on Samsung. You have slow motion. You have augmented reality lens, which is combined with AI, very useful. You have HDR, monochrome. I forgot to mention so far that this is, again, a suite of Leica cameras here, like we had it on the P30 Pro and on most of the Huawei phones in the last couple of years. So there is a strong cooperation between Leica, which is one of my most favorite camera brands, and Huawei on smartphones. And I come to the specs of the camera in a moment. But here in the more section, you also have, of course, monochrome, since we know that Leica has invested a lot in monochrome-only cameras. And there are also quite some reviews on my channel on Leica's monochrome cameras, they have a monochrome option here in the more section. Then we have light painting, is something I tried out on the P30 Pro, works absolutely flawless, very nice. Also works nice on the P40 Pro, of course. Panorama, high resolution, which gives you higher pixel density. Dual view is something I reviewed in Zurich on a march with a lot of people, and you find that video on my channel. Works exactly the same way on the P40 Pro. You have stickers, documents, underwater, and if you get lost in what all these menus mean, you actually get, like on the Samsung S20 Ultra, a help screen with all the descriptions of these different options in the more mode. You have a Pro mode here. In the Pro mode, in the same way as on the Samsung, you can toggle between, you know, shutter speed, you can influence manually your ISO, all these kind of things. You have a video mode. The video mode here has only 4K. So you have 4K up to 60 frames per second. You don't have an 8K option. And I think here the Samsung clearly has the nose in advance and is offering a better feature. And I come to that later in the video. But I think 4K and 60 frames per second is at par with the iPhone 11 Pro, and that works absolutely fine. You have the photo mode with all the settings here in the same way as on the Samsung. So you get aspect ratios, audio control, resolution, and everything to toggle here and change in the way you want to have it. You have portrait mode with its live focus on the Samsung. You can get nice portraits here with some bokeh effect, and you also have beauty effects here which you can overlay. You have a night mode. The night mode I reviewed a lot on the P30 Pro, works even better on the P40. And I think that's something where Huawei has gradual improvements. So there is no revolutionary jump here in the quality, but it is evolutionary development, which makes the P40 Pro, I think, advanced to the P30 Pro. And then you have aperture. And on aperture, you can now swipe here, and you have here more closed aperture, more open aperture. This goes down to 0.95, I think, yes. And 0.95, of course, is, like all apertures on all smartphone cameras, a simulation only, because these cameras have fixed apertures in their lenses, and everything you get in terms of aperture effect in photography is simulation only. I pointed this out many times on my channel because there's a lot of confusion. People think this is like a DSLR or DSLM. It's not. There is a fixed aperture. I come to it in the specs of the smartphone camera, and everything you see in terms of bokeh, shallow depth of field, things like that, when you play with the aperture, is just software simulation and digital. There is no mechanical aperture besides a fixed aperture on those lenses in the smartphone cameras. So I think that's it on a first look into the native camera apps, and I continue now with the video and looking quickly at the specs of the two cameras. So let's start with the Samsung S20 Ultra, and Samsung calls their camera system here a quad camera because it has 4 main camera lenses or sensors here. The first one is a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera. It has a field of view of 120 degrees. The second one is a 108 megapixel wide angle camera, and I would call this the standard lens. The field of view is 79 degrees, which is a typical focal length for a wide angle situation, also in prime lenses on DSLRs and DSLM. On both of those cameras we have fixed apertures, so on the ultra wide we have f2.2. On the wide angle, the standard camera, we have f1.8, so letting in a little more light. And as I said before, any change in aperture is software simulation. Apertures on smartphone lenses are fixed. And then we have a 48 megapixel telephoto camera, which is a lot of resolution for a tailless situation. And the field of view is very narrow with 24 degrees, and the aperture is 3.5. That's the most closed aperture on those 3 cameras here in the quad camera system. And you have a depth vision camera, which is used to measure distance, and that can be used when you simulate a wide open aperture, when you want to simulate a bokeh to get a shallow depth of field by digital algorithms and by software, and that's what they use the 4th camera, the depth vision camera, for. You have optical image stabilization, you have a tracking autofocus. I personally think in my testing in shooting situations, the tracking autofocus is not as good as it used to be on Samsung, but that's maybe, you know, a subjective impression I have from just playing with it and looking at it. And then what most camera manufacturers do in smartphone situations is they combine these lenses to achieve certain zoom situations. And Samsung gave it a name here for the first time. They call it the space zoom on the S20 Ultra. And there is an optical zoom, which is much less than 10 times. Then you have a hybrid optic zoom, which is still keeping quality and is combining digital enhancement with the optical zoom up to 10 times. And then you have what they call the super resolution zoom up to 100 times. And I think that is just an advertisement. It's a promotion. And that's, I think, the biggest weakness of the S20 Ultra, in particular when comparing it with the P40 Pro from Huawei. I think here Samsung really messed it up, but not because of hardware. I come to that in detail in the course of this video, but because of software. And we are going to cover that by samples and by shooting situations in a moment later in the video. So let's move on to the Huawei P40 Pro. And first of all, we have a 50 megapixel, what they call ultra vision camera. And they use a different color filter array. They use an RYYB filter. It's a bit technical to explain what that means, but they bet on better quality with that different filter design they have on that lens here. And then you have a 12 megapixel telephoto camera lens, and it has 5 times optical zoom, 10 times hybrid zoom. That's comparable to what we have on the Samsung, but on the digital enhancement side, it goes only up to 50 times, and I think that's very meaningful. Also, we will see a P40 Pro Plus in a short amount of time, which is even taking this beyond. So then we have a 40 megapixel ultra wide cine camera, and you see in general here that the resolution on the P40 Pro is less than what we see on the Samsung. But I can tell you already right now, and we'll look at samples in the course of that video, less is more, and Huawei is doing a much better job here. On Huawei's website, we find detailed specifications of the P40 Pro camera system, and I don't want to go through them in detail here, but I will come in a moment to what DxOMark is saying about the P40 Pro, which is always my personal reference for camera tests when it comes to sensors, smartphone cameras, DSLMs, DSLRs, and in particular also lenses and optical qualities. So here you find more specs on the Huawei page, and DxOMark comes in a moment. In general, I should say that these phones are very much comparable from the camera system, and the extraordinary specifications on 108 megapixels on the standard lens on the Samsung, or the 48 megapixel on the telezoom and a space zoom with up to 100 times what they call super resolution zoom. That is something which I criticize a lot, and when you look at the samples later in the video, we will see that I'm absolutely right about that. So let's quickly look at DxOMark, my personal reference for benchmarking phones, cameras, lenses. The Huawei P40 Pro made it again to become the #1 in that ranking. You also see the Mate 30 Pro 5G here, and in general leading the ranking, a lot of Chinese smartphones. You see the Apple iPhone 11 Pro Max here, which by manufacturing location is also Chinese because it comes from Shenzhen in mainland China. And you see the Oppo Reno 10 times zoom here. In general, it seems that these guys who test independently at DxOMark again found Huawei to be worth to be the #1 in that ranking, which means that by these testings we can trust that the camera system on the Huawei P40 Pro is doing a very good job and is actually doing better than most of the other smartphones. As I said, it's a shame that we cannot look up here the S20 Ultra, but nothing we can do about that. A remarkable feature which distinguishes the S20 Ultra from most smartphones is its capability of 8K video. And here I'm doing an experiment in my backyard, throwing an apple into a glass of water, and then later in the phone, in the smartphone, you can actually grab the frame, you scrub the timeline if you find the frame of interest to you, and when you have found that frame, you push that little button on the upper left-hand side corner, and the frame is stored in your smartphone, and you can later work on it in post-processing like here and create a stunning image which you would not be able to create otherwise. And the resolution, since it is 8K, is high. It's about 33 megapixel you get in resolution here, so even suitable for larger prints. Here's another example when we were hiking in order to test the smartphone. So I found this little place here with lots of chickens running around, erratically of course. And I was using the 8K video and then scrubbing the timeline to find that frame here. And since we have in these frames 33 megapixels, it has a lot of detail and is a very sharp image. Shooting 108 megapixels with the S20 Ultra will disable the zoom. And I come to that topic later when we talk about the space zoom. But you see here 12,000 times 9,000 pixels gives you a lot of reserves on cropping into the image. And if we go into Lightroom and look into that image by clicking into the image and zooming into 100%, you actually see that 108 megapixels on a smartphone, of course, is a lot of resolution. That image is very sharp. You see a lot of detail in the landscape, in the buildings. The only thing I'm seeing here at the horizon on the Swiss mountains is a little bit of artifact building, but that's probably normal because we have a very small sensor, although larger than in previous generations, but still small compared to a professional DSLM or DSLR, so these artifacts are something you can also correct in post, but in general, a nice picture. Here's another example taken under better light conditions, because the first sample I showed was taken at a time close to the evening. Again, the image reveals a lot of detail here, and if you think about 108 megapixels on a sensor as small as it is in this smartphone, and you make yourself aware that 108 megapixels is something typically you find on medium format cameras like the Phase 1 IQ3, then this is an astonishing and very good result. The horizon is a little bit smudgy again, so you see here these houses on the other side of the coast of Lake Zurich. They become a little bit smooth and soft, but in general a good result and something which needs to be positively noted what the S20 is achieving here. The S20 Ultra can also deal fairly well with night mode situations. So here's an image taken at night, and I was doing this from my backyard here, playing with the different options we have in the night mode, also in the Pro mode. And I think this is a good result. If you look into the night sky here, quite clean, quite clear. And this is part of the Orion star constellation, so Orion Belt and Orion Third. And I think the smartphone is dealing with night and low light situations very well. Also, if we look into the foreground and look at the bushes, trees, that little yellow house here, in general, a very clean image. And a few years ago, this would not have been thinkable to take an image like this with a smartphone. Let's now switch gears and let's turn our attention to the Huawei P40 Pro with that suite of Leica cameras in it. Telescope lens on the left-hand side and the three other lenses in this arrangement or ensemble of lenses here. And the first thing I want to look at is zoom. So that was also taken when we were hiking to test those two smartphones. Light was already dimming a little bit out, and I'm now here at 1x magnification. You also briefly saw on the right-hand side, it says blue sky first, then greenery. That's the AI, which is activated in the phone. Here we are now at the wide angle range, and now we are going to zoom in to that little village below the hill in order to see what the smartphone can do. So this is 1x magnification, we are taking a shot. This is 5x magnification, and I'm adjusting the tripod here a little bit. You see a fair amount of detail in the preview coming from the camera sensors, and I'm of course screen recording here what I'm doing. That's the built-in screen recorder from the P40 Pro. And later in post you can also deal with the light conditions here. And we're getting closer. You see it's still very, very sharp at 10x zoom. And the 10x on the P40 Pro, as I mentioned before, is a hybrid zoom. So you have all options, and just demonstrating for a moment how much the range is you can cover here. 1x, 5x magnification, and taking the image, and then 10x magnification. So you cover a wide range of shooting situations with the Huawei P40 Pro here. Going beyond 10x magnification, again, puts some challenge against my tripod here. But you see this is still very clear and clean at a 24x magnification. And we'll come to the differences to the S20 Ultra in a moment when we deal with what Samsung calls the space zoom. And I'm also taking a picture here at this resolution. I can get even closer here, up to 50x magnification. Again, that's an extrapolation based on digital enhancement. This is not an optical zoom. The optical zoom on the P40 Pro is 5x, and the 10x zoom is hybrid. So this image is already a little bit smudgy and is not, I think, a perfect image, but is also not surprising given the wide zoom range you have on the P40 Pro and later also on the S20 Ultra. And here, just in one swipe, zooming in from wide angle to 50x, you see the enormous range covered by the phone. If you want to take photos in RAW, the digital negative on the right hand side, the file size becomes pretty significant with 100 megabytes on the P40 Pro. And you see these are identical shots. One was a JPEG and one was a digital negative. Since we discussed night mode on the S20 Ultra, we should also briefly cover on the P40 Pro. And one thing is clear, the P40 Pro can see in the dark. And you saw at the beginning that was a pitch black scene here in my backyard. But if I do a night shot, I get this almost as brightened up as at daytime. And that is really remarkable. And even better, and I think the P40 Pro here is really better than the P30 Pro some time ago, it also keeps details which you not would be able to see with other smartphones. And if we look at the final image here, we come to a situation where in a pitch black night, the garden here is completely as in daylight, very nice, and is very sharp and crisp, very clean, almost no noise level, and the night sky shows still all the star constellations here at the horizon. And this is really remarkable. A lot of detail in the grass, in the bushes here, in the trees, on the house and the window, and the night sky looks fantastic. Clean star constellations all over the place. So to pause for a moment and looking at the phones side by side, they both have fantastic hardware, and everything I was showing so far is absolutely to my liking on both platforms, on both smartphones. The hardware is fantastic, and the capabilities at day, at night, resolution, zoom and so on, all looks very nice. But there is one thing I need to point out now, and for this let's first of all look into the metadata and compare certain magnifications here. So going into the S20 Ultra, we have the different magnifications pre-programmed on the right hand side, and I take now a shot at every magnification, so currently at 2 times, then at 4 times, and so on up to 100 times. And then I want to quickly discuss the EXIF and metadata in order to make understandable how the space zoom on the S20 Ultra is really working and what is optical and what is digital. And the EXIF metadata of an image always reveals a lot of interesting information. For instance, here we see in this shot at the wide angle lens, we have a 13mm focal length if we count this in equivalence to a full frame sensor. And that is a useful information, but there is much more useful to discover here, and I'm going to discuss this now in the next couple of minutes. So here's the collection of all EXIF metadata screenshots I did from the series of images I took before. And we started with the 0.5 times lens, so this is the ultra wide angle lens, and we already saw that the full frame equivalent focal length is 13mm, but there is another information here which is called digital zoom ratio, and that is set to 1 here. So let's look at the 1 times, so the standard lens, and here we have a focal length of full frame equivalent of 25mm, and again a digital zoom ratio of 1. Moving on to 2 times magnification, we still find the focal length in 35mm film, which always refers to the lens taking the shot as 25mm, but we see that the digital zoom ratio now changed to 2, which makes 2 times 25 is a 50mm full frame equivalent. And we see here that in an early stage, Samsung is already using digital enhancements to achieve a focal length of 50mm. Going now to 4 times magnification, we find the focal length of 103mm, and that can be found in various articles in the internet, that this is the physical focal length of the telescope lens. So we switched now lenses from the standard lens 25mm to the telezoom lens 103mm at a 35mm equivalent. But we also see the digital zoom ratio went up to 4. So that's basically counting how much digital enhancement you have, whereas having here on this particular lens, it should actually show a 1 because that's completely optical here. So the S20 Ultra has an optical zoom of 4 times. Moving on to 10 times magnification, we stay on the telescope lens here with 103mm of focal length, and the digital ratio here is 10 now, which means that we are at 10 times magnification. And between 4 times optical and 10 times magnification, there is what Samsung calls a hybrid zoom. And a hybrid zoom is a technique also used by Huawei and other smartphone manufacturers. And that basically combines an optical zoom of 4 times with digital magnification. And that happens typically by pixel binning and cropping into the sensor in the way you also have it when you do magnifications by just zooming in on your post-processing tool from Adobe or whatever you have. Going to 30 times magnification, we're staying on the telescope lens, 103 millimeters, and we have a digital zoom ratio of 30 times here. And the same happens if we go to 100 times magnification. We stay on the telescope lens and basically have a factor of 100 here. So what we learned from this little exercise is that Samsung is combining in a clever way 3 optical lenses and uses in between to interpolate and then later from 4 times optical zoom on to extrapolate pixel binning and cropping, relying on the large resolution they have on the main lens with 108 megapixel and on the telescope lens with 48 megapixel to achieve these digital enhancements and to get the zoom up to 10 times hybrid, 30 times and 100 times. This clearly explains why if you go for the 108 megapixel shooting option, and in particular if you want to do this in RAW and not only in JPEG, you have no zoom options available because there is no possibility if you want to have the full resolution to use a crop or to use pixel binning in order to interpolate or extrapolate for higher magnifications. I'm now in Capture One here and want to compare the Huawei images, which are on the left hand side, with the Samsung images on the right hand side. And don't get confused here from the focal length. This is the physical focal length, but you see even on the physical focal length that the Samsung here is more wide and more ultra wide than what we have on the Huawei. And I should say that because we didn't speak about that after that excursion into the way Samsung is implementing their space zoom, Huawei is using kind of the same technique by interpolation and extrapolation using pixel binning, using digital enhancements like crop, and is basically relying on the same technology. And as I said at the beginning of the video, the hardware of both phones is at par. They are both fantastic phones. The problem I see with Samsung is the way they implemented their camera software. I'm going to demonstrate this now. In Capture One, I can keep pushing the Shift key and then I can zoom in simultaneously on both images here. So let's do this. This is 100% crop, 200%, 300%, 400%. And let's compare certain objects in those images side by side. And the first one is, let's bring them close, the image here on the building and on the Huawei side here. And what you see here is that on the Samsung side, there is an aggressive softening going on. These images are smoothed out, and maybe it's for noise reduction. Maybe there are other reasons why Samsung is doing this. As I said before, high resolution on a small sensor comes with a price. But it's not necessary because Huawei is not doing that, and you see much more structure here on the left-hand side and more details than what you see on the right-hand side with Samsung. And it becomes also clear if you look at the forest here. And by the way, the coloring is also something very interesting if you compare it. So this photo has been taken in April, and April is spring, and in spring you should not have this fall-like colors here. In this brownish situation, you should have green trees. But most importantly, you see much more details here, much more structure in the Huawei image than what you see on the Samsung image. And that is something very interesting. You also see it in different situations. I think here that's an interesting example. Let's look at this one here. Let's see if we find this on the Samsung side. I think we're here. So look at this house here. And here the windows are clean rectangles. Here the windows are just black dots. And even on that house here, where you get a lot of details on the Huawei side, you don't see the same details on the Samsung side. And that's like a red line going through all shooting situations with different magnifications. Samsung is using an aggressive softening algorithm to smooth these images out. And the problem is, you could say, why don't you switch to RAW? But RAW is only available in certain shooting situations and not, of course, in zoom situations. And that's why you have to rely on the in-smartphone image processing when the JPEG is processed, and then there's nothing you can do. The information which is actually caught by the sensor is completely lost. And I will make at the end of the video an example which shows this very, very clear, where when the Samsung smartphone is looking through the lens and I do a screen recording, it's capturing the details even at extreme zooms, but the JPEG, when you take the picture, is completely ruined by Samsung's softening or smoothing algorithm. So here's another example in Capture One, and the focal length is not fully comparable. We saw this before On the wide angle shot, there is a slightly different setup on the Samsung than what we have on the Huawei. But it nevertheless shows the point I want to make. If you compare the houses here, if you compare the structure on that industrial building here, you see how aggressively Samsung is smoothing this out. And this softening is going on at all different shooting situations. And if you don't have the RAW option, which you only have in special situations, it ruins your picture and you lose clarity, detail, and you don't have the option in your own hand. I have no problem in getting more noise or, more pixel building, whatever it is. I can deal with it in many situations in post-processing, but if I get a smoothed out JPEG, I just lost the information I wanted to capture. So here's another shot I took when we were hiking outside of Zurich to actually do these test shootings with the Samsung S20 Ultra. And this is a 10 times zoom, and that's the hybrid zoom. So 4 times optical and then combined with pixel binning and cropping to achieve a 10 times magnification. And I think that image looks pretty much okay. So I can live with that quality here. Moving on to 30 times magnification, the softness of the image is not bearable. And it doesn't look like a photo, it looks more like an oil painting or some filter you have applied to the image, and that gets much worse, of course, if you go to the 100 times space zoom, because then there is absolutely no structure recognizable here. It's an oil painting, it's an aggressive filter, and as I will show now in a moment, this is completely unnecessary because the hardware Samsung built into this phone can do much better. So let's have a look at this and then conclude the video. So here's the S20 Ultra again, and people on my channel know that I love working with moon photography, with DSLMs, but also with the P40 Pro and other cameras in smartphones. And what can be a better test, 30 times magnification here, than trying to zoom the moon when Samsung talks about a space zoom. So that seems to be very natural. And what I'm going to do is now I will stop the video here for a moment. And let's pause here and let's have a look at what the camera through the lens is seeing here. A lot of structure. It's actually amazing what that hardware of the Samsung S20 Ultra is seeing as structure at a 30 times magnification in the moon. As I said at the beginning, it's a fantastic hardware, but I show you in a moment what actually you will end up with if you now push the shutter button and take a picture of that moon. So let's continue with the video and let's see if we can go further. So that was about 30 times magnification. I'm now going up to more than 50 times magnification, and still we see a lot of structure on the moon here. It's looking very good. It's actually even looking, I think, a little better than what I saw before some time ago on the P40 Pro. Stopping the video again and looking at the structure of the moon, I'm curious when we have the next clear moon night sky, whether the P40 Pro can actually keep pace with that quality I see here through the lens on the Samsung S20 Ultra. So it's remarkable what that hardware can produce. Incredible detail, beyond 50 times magnification, and a very crisp, clean picture of the moon with a smartphone, which always amazes and fascinates me. So continuing with that screen recording here, and seeing if we can get any further. So we are going now up to 80, beyond 80 times magnification here. And it gets harder and harder even with the tripod to keep the situation sturdy here. And still we see at this magnification good structure of the moon. And I'm sorry for that shaking. Even on the tripod it was at this leverage or lever you have when you have a magnification more than 80 times. Almost impossible. Every slightest little shake on the tripod was bringing this into vibrations, but the structure of the moon is clearly recognizable. And look at that, if I turn down brightness here, how much you see on the moon. And that is amazing, it's fascinating, I love it, but the pictures coming out of that phone are so disappointing. So this is what you get in terms of JPEGs. In that shooting situation, you get a very smudgy, very softened out, very much not usable image of the moon. And the larger the magnification gets, the worse the oil painting type style and appearance of those moon images. And it gets worse, of course, beyond the 80 times magnification. Absolutely not recognizable. Well, with some fantasy you might want to say this is a moon, but compared to the structure and detail we saw through the lens in that screen recording on the smartphone, it's the smartphone software in the camera app which ruins the capabilities of the built-in hardware. So the Samsung S20 Ultra has all ingredients to be a fantastic smartphone camera. Here's another night shot from one of the nights out of my backyard. And I should say it's fantastic hardware. It has all the ingredients. It's the software which breaks the deal and doesn't deliver in the way it should deliver. So concluding on the video, the Samsung S20 Ultra and the brand new Huawei P40 Pro are both fantastic smartphones. There are many other good things to tell about those phones besides the cameras, of course, but the Huawei clearly is superior because of software, not because of hardware. Whereas I should say, as a Leica fanboy, probably the Leica camera setup we have in the Huawei P40 Pro is also something I personally would prefer, but Samsung could easily fix those issues by a software update with improved capabilities. If you liked my video, please give me a thumbs up. If you like my channel, you are invited to subscribe to stay tuned on my content. Stay safe and healthy, and peace out.